Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation, has one of the most unusual birth stories in Greek mythology. His origins are layered with paradoxes, reflecting his dual nature as both a god of joy and madness, life and rebirth. His birth story is often told in two major variations, the Olympian version and the Orphic version. In this video, we will be retelling the story of Dionysus the Olympian god, his birth, rebirth, madness, love, and other various myths. The halls of Olympus gleamed with golden light, but in the mortal realm of Thebes, a fateful love story was unfolding. Semele, daughter of King Cadmus, had caught the eye of Zeus, the thunderer. The king of the gods, ever enthralled by beauty, descended from the heavens, disguised in mortal form. Beneath the cover of night, he whispered secrets only gods should know, and soon Semele carried his child in her womb. But the gods are never free from jealousy, and Hera, queen of Olympus, learned of the affair. Wrathful and cunning, she devised a plan to strike down the mortal who dared bear Zeus's son. Disguising herself as a frail old woman, she approached Semele, feigning kindness. "Child, do you not wonder if your lover is truly the great Zeus?" Hera's voice was sweet as honey, yet thick with poison. Any man could claim divinity. Would not the mighty king of gods reveal himself to you in his full immortal form? Doubt crept into Semele's heart. That very night, when Zeus arrived in all his charm and warmth, she clutched his hands and begged him, "Swear by the river Styx that you will grant me one wish." Zeus, bound by the unbreakable oath, replied, "Whatever you desire shall be yours, beloved." With the trap set, Semele uttered her request, "Show yourself to me as you do to Hera." Zeus's heart clenched. He pleaded with her to reconsider, but the oath was made. With a mournful sigh, the skies rumbled and the heavens split open. Zeus, in his true divine form, shone with a light too great for mortal eyes. Thunderbolts flashed, flames erupted, and Semele screamed as her mortal body was consumed in celestial fire. Yet in that moment of destruction, life still clung to her. Within her burning body, the child stirred. Dionysus was not meant to perish. Zeus reached into the inferno and plucked the unborn child from Semele's womb. But the child was too small, too fragile to survive on his own. With no other choice, Zeus cut open his own thigh and placed the infant within, sewing the wound shut with divine thread. For months, the child grew inside the flesh of a god, nourished by divine blood. And when the time came, the stitches burst open, and Dionysus was born anew, twice born, the god of wine and madness, of ecstasy and transformation. Yet there was no time for celebration. Hera's wrath burned hotter than Zeus's lightning, and the queen of the gods would not suffer the child to live. Dionysus was the son of Semele, a mortal woman who had perished by Hera's design, and now her vengeance turned toward the infant she had left behind. Zeus, foreseeing his wife's rage, knew that he had only one choice. The child must be hidden. As Hera's voice howled across the heavens, Zeus gathered the infant in his arms and turned to Hermes, the swift-footed messenger. "Take him, Hermes. Keep him safe. Far from Olympus. He must live." Hermes nodded, and cradling the newborn god, disappeared in a flash of golden light. The first refuge lay in the palace of King Athamas and Queen Ino, the sister of Semele. With care, Hermes placed the infant into Ino's arms, whispering, "Raise him as your own. Let him grow among mortals, unseen by the gods." Ino, though fearful of Hera's vengeance, could not deny the child of her sister. She swaddled Dionysus in fine cloth and rocked him gently, disguising him as a girl to deceive Hera's watchful gaze. But gods cannot be hidden for long. Hera soon discovered the deception and in her fury sent madness upon King Athamas. The king, driven to insanity, mistook his own son for a deer and slaughtered him. Queen Ino, fleeing Hera's torment, leapt into the sea with her other child, Melicertes, and together they became the sea deities, Leucothea and Palemon. With the household in ruin, Hermes returned, taking the infant from the wreckage before Hera could strike again. "We must go deeper into the wilds," Hermes murmured. And so they fled once more, far beyond the reaches of Olympus. In a land unknown to gods and mortals alike, lay a secret haven, Mount Nysa. Here, the land was wild and untamed, a place where vines twisted over ancient trees and rivers sang in hushed tones. It was in this sacred grove that Hermes placed the child into the care of the Hyads, rain-bringing nymphs and Nysian nymphs, divine maidens who knew the ways of the earth. "Raise him well," Hermes commanded. "Teach him to know both the joys and sorrows of the world, for he is to be a god unlike any other." And so, Dionysus grew hidden from Olympus, nurtured by nature itself. The nymphs wove crowns of ivy for his small head. They bathed him in the waters of sacred springs. He learned to run with the wild beasts, to sing with the birds, and to dance beneath the silver moonlight. As he grew older, the earth itself responded to his presence. Vines sprouted wherever his feet touched the soil. Grapes swelled upon the branches of the trees. The nymphs watched in awe as he laughed, as he twirled in ecstasy, as the first drops of fermented wine trickled from the fruits he had unknowingly blessed. They told him of his past in whispers, of his mother lost to fire, of his father who ruled the skies, of the goddess who sought to end his life. And yet they assured him he was more than a god. He was life itself, untamed and unbound. The child who had been hidden for so long had grown into a god unlike any other. Raised among nymphs and wild creatures, Dionysus walked the earth, neither bound to Olympus nor fully part of the mortal world. Wherever he stepped, vines sprang from the ground, heavy with fruit, and laughter followed in his wake. He was young, beautiful, crowned in ivy, and filled with an intoxicating energy that drew both gods and mortals toward him. Yet no matter how far he wandered, there was one presence he could not escape. Hera, the queen of the gods, had never forgotten him. Zeus had defied her by saving Semele's son, and no child of an adulterous union would go unpunished. She had already burned Semele to ashes. Now she would break Dionysus's mind. One evening, as Dionysus walked along the slopes of Mount Nysa, a shadow passed over the sky. It was unseen and silent, but its presence curled into the air like the scent of burning incense. The moment the god inhaled, a cold shudder ran through his body. Then the world tilted. The trees twisted into monstrous shapes. The sky bled into the earth. The laughter of his nymph companions warped into shrieks, their voices rising like the howls of dying animals. Dionysus stumbled, his vision blurred, his thoughts unraveled. He could not remember who he was. A voice whispered in his mind, but it was not his own. It laughed at him, called him an abomination, a bastard god, an outsider. "You are nothing." The voice twisted inside his skull like a viper. His feet carried him away from Nysa, away from everything he had known. The vines that had once flourished under his touch withered. The fruit that had once burst with sweetness rotted upon the vine. Dionysus had lost himself. For years, he wandered the world, wild-eyed and lost, moving from land to land, like a shadow of himself. He forgot his name, his power, his birthright. He roamed through Egypt, Phrygia, and Syria, his bare feet bleeding upon the cracked earth. He draped himself in animal skins, his hair tangled with leaves, his voice reduced to the murmurs of a man on the edge of madness. But the world knew him, even if he did not know himself. Wherever he went, people whispered of a strange man, a divine being who carried both chaos and joy within him. Some feared him, some pitied him, and others saw something divine beneath the madness. In his wanderings, he came to Phrygia, where the great mother Rhea ruled over wild nature and ecstatic rites. She had been watching him from afar, waiting for the moment to restore him. As Dionysus stumbled through her sacred mountains, the sound of drums and flutes filled the air. Rhea's followers, the Corybantes, surrounded him, their faces wild with ritual ecstasy. They danced, they sang, they beat their drums so loudly that the very air trembled with sound. And then they seized him. With their hands, they pressed him to the earth, holding him down as he struggled. The drums beat faster, the flutes shrieked, the ground beneath him seemed to crack open, and for the first time in years, Dionysus saw himself. The memories rushed back, his mother, his father, the fire, the thigh birth, the nymphs of Nysa, the vines, the wine, the power. He screamed, but it was not a cry of madness. It was a rebirth. When Dionysus rose from the ground, he was not the same. He had wandered through the abyss of insanity and emerged stronger. He was no longer a lost child of Zeus, nor a mere wanderer. He was a god of transformation, of divine ecstasy and madness. He embraced the wildness that Hera had cursed him with. He gathered his first followers, satyrs, maenads, and revelers, who knew the truth of freedom and excess. He took the power of madness and made it his own, turning suffering into ecstasy, pain into joy. And then, with a crown of ivy upon his brow, Dionysus set forth into the world. No longer lost, no longer forgotten. He was Dionysus, the liberator, and all the world would know his name. The winds howled across the plains of Thrace, carrying the scent of blood and iron. Atop his black warhorse, King Lycurgus rode through his kingdom, his hands clenched around the reins like a man gripping the edge of a blade. His kingdom was one of order, discipline, and war. Lycurgus, son of Dryas, ruled the kingdom of the Edonians with an iron will, a man who feared no god and bowed to no law but his own. He was a king of discipline, a ruler who despised madness, chaos, and indulgence, and no god embodied those things more than Dionysus. So when Dionysus arrived in Thrace, leading his sacred retinue of maenads, satyrs, and nymphs, Lycurgus saw not a god, but a threat, and he would not suffer it. Before Dionysus' arrival, a terrible fate had already begun to take hold of Lycurgus. One night, a drunken haze consumed him, the wine flowing too freely, too deeply, filling his veins with fire instead of reason. And in this cursed state, he turned his eyes upon his own mother. Whether it was divine punishment or his own failing, he reached for her, made advances that should never have been made. When the wine wore off, he saw what he had done. He was a king, a ruler of unshakable order, and now he was drowning in his own shame. It was Dionysus, he decided. The god's influence was already poisoning his land, corrupting his senses, and so he made a decision. Dionysus and his followers had to be expelled. With his warriors at his side, Lycurgus stormed through his kingdom, his voice thunderous, his wrath unforgiving. He drove the maenads into exile, tearing them from their wild dances, from their drunken ecstasy. He hunted the satyrs, their laughter silenced by spears and chains. He cut down the ivy and the sacred garlands, defiling the symbols of the god of wine and madness. But his greatest crime was yet to come. For among Dionysus's followers was Ambrosia, a devoted nurse of the god, an innocent woman who had only ever sung his praises and tended to his rites. Lycurgus found her in his palace, and in his fury he struck her down with an axe, the blade slicing through flesh and bone. Dionysus himself watched as her blood pooled upon the ground. The god, young but immortal, wild but vengeful, knew that Lycurgus would not stop until everything sacred was destroyed. And so, for the first time, Dionysus fled. He and his followers leaped into the sea, finding refuge in an underwater cave beneath the protection of Thetis, the nymph of the deep. But the god did not forget. Lycurgus had drawn blood, and now his own blood would be spilled. When Lycurgus returned to his kingdom, he was not satisfied with exile and slaughter. Dionysus was a god of vines, of the grape, of the lifeblood of wine itself. So Lycurgus took up his axe and cut down every vine in Thrace, tearing their roots from the soil, cursing the god's name as he destroyed the fruit of his worship. But Dionysus was watching, and the god cursed him. Darkness seeped into Lycurgus's mind, creeping like the roots of the vines he had tried to destroy. His thoughts turned against him, his vision blurred, and suddenly, before him stood Dionysus and his followers, laughing, whispering, mocking him. Lycurgus roared in fury. He grabbed his axe, his hands steady despite the storm raging in his mind, and he struck them down, one by one, again and again. The blood splattered across the palace floor. The bodies fell lifeless at his feet. And then the madness lifted, and he saw the truth. There was no Dionysus, no Maenads, no satyrs, no nymphs, only his own son, Dryas, dismembered at his feet, his own flesh and blood, torn apart by his hands. The gods do not suffer such sins lightly. As Lycurgus grieved, the land withered. The fields turned to dust. The rivers dried. The heavens refused to weep for Thrace. Famine and drought consumed the land, and the people began to starve. Desperate, they turned to the oracle, seeking salvation, begging for guidance. And the oracle spoke. The land will not bear fruit so long as Lycurgus lives. The king's own people turned against him. He had murdered his son. He had brought the gods' wrath upon them. And now he was the only thing standing between them and survival. They dragged their king to the Mount Pangaeum, the place where once he had stood proud, where once he had ruled without fear. And there they threw him to the wild horses, the beasts who had once obeyed his command. The horses tore into him, their teeth ripping his flesh, their hooves crushing his bones. His screams echoed through the valleys, fading into the wind, into the earth, into the silence of the gods. And at last, the land was freed. The rivers flowed again. The vines grew once more, and Dionysus, from his place among the immortals, smiled. For the king who had defied him had paid the price in blood, and his name would forever be a warning, a tale of madness, of sacrilege, and of a god's vengeance. The story of Lycurgus of Thrace. The sea sparkled beneath the morning sun, waves lapping gently at the shore. Far from the halls of Olympus, far from the revels of his followers, Dionysus stood alone upon the sands of a foreign land. He had taken the form of a young prince, his skin glowing like polished ivory, his hair dark as the vines that curled around his temples. He wore a purple cloak, rich as the wine that would one day bear his name, and his eyes carried a mischief that mortals never recognized until it was too late. From the nearby harbor, a group of Tyrrhenian pirates spotted him. Their captain, a greedy man with a heart like blackened iron, nudged his first mate and whispered, "Look at him. A king's son, perhaps, maybe a merchant's heir. Either way, he'll fetch a fine ransom." The crew murmured in agreement. They saw only a helpless boy, lost and alone, ripe for the taking. They did not see the god beneath the flesh. With silent precision, the pirates rushed from their ship, their sandaled feet pounding against the shore. They grabbed Dionysus by his arms, ignoring the serene smile upon his lips, and dragged him onto their vessel. The pirate captain stood before him, arms crossed, a wicked grin on his face. "Where do you hail from, boy?" he asked. Dionysus did not answer. The men shoved him toward the mast, binding his hands with rough ropes, yet the god only laughed, a soft, knowing chuckle that sent a chill down the sailors' spines. "Captain," one of the crewmen muttered uneasily, "this boy is strange. Look at his eyes. He does not fear us." But the captain scoffed. "He's just some noble brat. Keep him tied up. We'll sail for the open waters and demand his ransom soon enough." The ship lurched forward as the wind caught its sails. The crew turned their eyes to the horizon, unaware that the god they had captured was already changing the world around them. It started as a whisper, a shift in the air, the scent of blooming vines where there had been only salt. One of the sailors turned and gasped. The ropes binding the boy's hands had fallen away, but Dionysus had not moved. The knots had unraveled on their own, as though the very air had loosened them. Then came the vines. Dark green tendrils slithered up the mast, thickening and twisting, bursting with heavy clusters of grapes. They coiled around the wood, creeping over the deck, spreading faster than any mortal plant should. The sailors cried out in alarm, drawing their swords, slashing at the vines, but for every one they cut, 10 more took its place. Then, from the bow of the ship, a rich, crimson liquid began to flow, wine. It spilled over the deck, pooling beneath their feet, filling the air with its heady fragrance. The pirates stumbled back, their minds already clouding from the scent alone. And then the laughter came, soft at first, then louder. The boy they had captured was no longer just a boy. He stood taller now, his skin glowing like sunlight through the leaves, his cloak billowing with a life of its own. His eyes shone like golden embers, and on his head a crown of ivy had sprouted, blooming with leaves and berries. Dionysus had revealed himself. The sailors fell to their knees, trembling, but the captain, ever prideful, raised his sword. "You tricked us, god or not," he snarled. "I will not kneel." Dionysus tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "Then stand, and run if you dare." And then he became the lion. Where Dionysus had stood, there was now a massive beast, its golden mane wild in the sea breeze, its great fangs gleaming with divine hunger. The lion roared, shaking the heavens, its voice echoing across the waves. The pirates screamed. One by one, they leapt into the sea, throwing themselves overboard, desperate to escape the wrath of the god. But Dionysus was not yet finished. Even as they splashed into the waters, their bodies began to twist and shrink. Their arms fused to their sides, their legs melted together, their skin darkened to shades of blue and gray. Their screams turned to high-pitched clicks and whistles. They were no longer men. They were dolphins. The once proud pirates swam in frantic circles, their new bodies cutting through the waves. Their minds were still their own, and they understood. This was their punishment. Only one man remained untouched. The lone sailor who, from the very start, had whispered, "This boy is strange." Dionysus turned to him, his golden eyes filled with something almost kind. "You alone saw the truth," the god murmured. "Go then, tell the world who I am." The sailor, shaking, bowed low before the god and leapt into the rowboat, paddling for shore as fast as his hands could carry him. Dionysus, now fully himself, stepped onto the crest of a wave. The sea bore him effortlessly, and as he turned away, the ship that had once carried him vanished beneath the waves, consumed by the ocean. The dolphins leapt and spun through the air, their bodies glistening in the sunlight. Though cursed, they would forever remember the god who had punished them. And so, to this day, when dolphins race alongside ships, sailors smile and whisper, "They were once men, pirates who defied Dionysus, and now they serve him forever." The night was silent on the shores of Naxos, save for the whisper of the waves and the distant cries of seabirds. The stars shimmered overhead, cold and indifferent, as a lone woman knelt upon the sand, weeping. Her dress, once woven with the golden threads of Crete, was torn and stained with salt. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her tear-streaked face. Her name was Ariadne, and she had been betrayed. Only hours before, she had stood upon the deck of a great ship, her heart filled with hope, her hands wrapped around the strong arms of her beloved, Theseus, the hero of Athens, the slayer of the Minotaur. She had saved him. She had defied her father, King Minos of Crete. She had given Theseus the thread that guided him through the labyrinth, allowing him to escape the horror of the Minotaur's lair. She had fled with him, believing in his promises of love, of marriage, of a future beside him. But they were lies. What Ariadne did not know was that the gods themselves had chosen her fate long before she had ever set eyes upon Theseus. On the eve of their departure from Crete, as Theseus prepared to take Ariadne to Athens as his bride, a voice echoed through his dreams, deep as the ocean and resounding with power. Dionysus had spoken, "Theseus, you shall not take Ariadne to Athens. She is not yours to wed. I have chosen her as my own." The hero awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He was a mortal, a warrior, but he knew better than to defy a god. And so, at dawn, he left her behind. As Ariadne slept beneath the shade of a myrtle tree, Theseus and his men quietly sailed away, their ship disappearing over the horizon. Ariadne had awoken to emptiness. The ship, once bright upon the horizon, had become a mere shadow, shrinking into the endless blue. She had called his name, screamed it into the wind, but Theseus never turned back, and now she was alone. The night deepened, and Ariadne's tears dried upon her cheeks. There was no escape from this island, no hope of rescue. The gods had abandoned her, or so she thought. From the darkness beyond the trees, a sound arose, a rustling, a whisper, a song. The wind carried the scent of wine and myrrh, of honey and wild ivy. And then the drums began. The ground trembled with distant footsteps, with laughter both joyous and wild. Golden torches flared, their light flickering between the trees, and the melody of unseen flutes wove through the air like a spell. Ariadne lifted her head, her breath catching in her throat. For there, emerging from the shadows, was a god. He was wreathed in ivy, his hair dark as the night, his eyes gleaming like amber, catching the firelight. He wore no crown, yet he walked like a king, his cloak of deep purple trailing behind him like the folds of twilight itself. And when he saw her, he smiled. Dionysus had come. Ariadne did not move, her heart pounding in her chest as the god approached. "Who has left you here, bright-eyed one?" Dionysus murmured, his voice smooth as flowing wine. The words caught in Ariadne's throat. She could not say it, not yet, not to him. But the god already knew. "Theseus," he said, the name turning to ash upon his tongue. Dionysus knelt beside her, his fingers brushing the dried tears from her cheeks. There was no pity in his gaze, no sorrow, only recognition. "You are not meant to mourn him," he told her, his lips curving into a smile. "You are meant to reign." Ariadne, stunned, could only stare. But behind Dionysus, the revelers danced, the torches blazed, the drums pounded, and the world seemed to awaken. The vines curled toward her feet. The stars shimmered above her, as if leaning closer. The sea, once cruel and heartless, sang a different song. The god extended his hand. "Come with me, Ariadne. Be my queen." And so she did. That night, the forgotten princess of Crete became the beloved of a god. Dionysus lifted her into his chariot, drawn by golden panthers, and they rode through the heavens as the stars themselves rejoiced. In the lands beyond mortal reach, their wedding was celebrated. The nymphs wove garlands of myrtle and ivy. The Maenads sang songs of love and longing, and the gods themselves looked upon Dionysus and his bride with favor. For Ariadne, abandoned upon the shores of Naxos, had not been forsaken. She had been chosen. And when her mortal years at last came to an end, Dionysus would not allow her to fade into the underworld. Instead, he took her crown, a gift of golden stars, and cast it into the heavens. There it remains even now, shining among the constellations, the corona borealis, the crown of Ariadne. For she was no longer the princess who had been left behind. She was the goddess who had been found. And in Dionysus' arms, she would never be alone again. The halls of Olympus shone with golden light, the laughter of gods echoing through the air. Yet among the revels and divine feasts, Dionysus sat apart, silent, his cup of wine untouched. For all his power, for all the joy and madness he brought to the world, there was one thing he could not forget: his mother, Semele. She had been immortal, the daughter of Cadmus, the woman who had dared to love Zeus. But her love had ended in flame, burned to ashes by the power of the god's true form. And when she died, no hand had reached for her. No god had saved her. She had descended into Hades' realm, the land of the dead, where her soul remained, forgotten and alone. And Dionysus, the god of revelry, the twice-born, the liberator, could not accept this. "She bore me into this world," he murmured. "Now I will bring her back." To reach the land of the dead, no ordinary path would do. Dionysus sought the wisdom of the gods, and at last an answer was given. Seek the way through Prosimnus. And so Dionysus traveled to the edge of the mortal world, to a place where the rivers ran black and the air grew heavy with silence. There, a man named Prosimnus, an old and knowing guide, stood waiting. "You seek the path to Hades," Prosimnus said, his voice rough as the wind through dead leaves. "Few dare to walk it, fewer return." Dionysus met his gaze, unwavering. "I am not like other gods." And so Prosimnus led him, through forests where no birds sang, past rivers that whispered the names of the dead, until at last they reached the place where the earth itself opened, revealing a darkness deeper than night. "This is the way," Prosimnus said, and without hesitation, Dionysus stepped into the underworld. The air was thick with silence, the weight of eternity pressing upon his shoulders. Dionysus walked where no living soul belonged, past spirits who moaned in endless longing, past figures half remembered, lost in the fog of death. he saw Sisyphus, forever pushing his boulder uphill, only for it to fall again. He saw Tantalus, reaching for water and fruit that would never touch his lips. He saw the nameless dead, their faces empty, wandering with no hope of returning to the light. And then he found her, Semele. She was pale as moonlight, her mortal form untouched by time, her eyes wide with shock as she beheld the figure before her. Dionysus, she whispered, her son, the child she had lost before he was even born, the god who had grown beyond her world, who had become more than mortal, more than divine. And yet he had come for her. But the dead are not so easily reclaimed. For before Dionysus could reach her, another presence filled the hall. A figure clad in shadow, a crown of obsidian upon his brow. Hades, lord of the underworld. His gaze was dark, his voice deep as the shifting earth. You should not have come here, Dionysus. The god of wine did not kneel. He met the gaze of the Lord of the Dead without fear. I have come for my mother. Hades was silent for a long moment. She is mine now, he said. No soul returns from my kingdom without cost. Dionysus tilted his head, a small smile playing at his lips. Then name your price. The dead god's expression did not change. He had no need for gold or wine, no desire for the pleasures of the living. But Dionysus knew another truth. Even in the underworld, there was hunger. And so, he offered what only he could give, not wealth, not power, but something deeper. Let my rites be honored in your name, he said. Let wine flow even in death. Let the spirits of the underworld drink and know joy, even in their silence. A pause, and then Hades laughed, a low, rolling sound, like distant thunder over empty fields. Very well, Dionysus, he said, take her. But know this, no mortal leaves this place unchanged. And with a wave of his hand, the deal was sealed. Dionysus took his mother's hand, and together they walked through the halls of the dead. As they passed, the shades lifted their heads, drawn to the divine presence that moved among them. Some wept without knowing why. Others reached out, their hands grazing the air where Dionysus had passed, as if hoping to feel one last warmth before eternity claimed them. But Dionysus did not stop. He led Semele out of the darkness, past the rivers of sorrow, past the gates of the underworld, until at last they stepped into the light. The heavens shook, the stars blazed brighter than before, and as the gods of Olympus turned their gaze to the returning sun, Zeus himself rose from his throne, for no mere mortal could walk upon Olympus. And so Semele was reborn. Her form changed, her body bathed in divine fire, her soul woven into the fabric of the heavens. She was no longer the mortal princess of Thebes. She was Thyone, goddess of ecstatic frenzy, mother of the twice-born. And beside her, Dionysus smiled, for the god who had once been saved from death had now saved another, and his mother would never be forgotten again. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, may the tales of ancient myth continue to captivate and inspire.